They tried to erase it from every record. The census forms were burned. The newspaper archives disappeared. Even the cemetery stones were ground to powder and scattered. But you can't destroy what lives in the memories of the mountains themselves, and you can't silence the truth that echoes through the hollows of West Virginia when the wind picks up just right. The Craydon Family traveling exhibition wasn't supposed to be remembered, but tonight you're going to learn why some secrets refuse to stay buried. The year was 1847, when Silas Craydon first brought his peculiar family down from the remote peaks of the Allegheny Mountains. They came in covered wagons, 13 souls bound by blood so concentrated that their very existence challenged the natural order. What the good people of Charleston saw that autumn morning wasn't a traveling show. It was a revelation that would haunt the consciousness of Appalachia for generations to come. You have to understand the isolation of these mountain families. For 3 generations, the Craydons had lived in a valley so remote that maps refused to acknowledge its existence. The nearest settlement was 40 miles through treacherous terrain, accessible only during the brief summer months when the mountain passes weren't choked with snow and ice. In that isolation, something had grown, something that defied every law of nature and human decency. Silas himself was the patriarch, a man whose lineage could be traced through an unbroken chain of father-daughter unions, stretching back to the first Craydon, who had fled into these mountains in 1783. His wife, Sarah, was also his granddaughter. Their children were born of a genetic compression so severe that what emerged from those mountain cabins belonged more to nightmare than reality. Yet Silas, with a cunning that sometimes emerges from the deepest depravity, recognized that what horror had created, commerce could exploit. The exhibition that rolled into Charleston that September morning promised nature's most curious specimens and the marvel of human variation. The townspeople paid their nickels eagerly, expecting perhaps a bearded lady or a man with unusual height. What they encountered instead would send 3 grown men into permanent madness and cause the local preacher to burn his church to the ground rather than attempt another sermon in a world that could produce such abominations. In the largest wagon, displayed like prized livestock, were Silas and Sarah's surviving offspring. There was Ezekiel, whose head had grown to nearly twice normal size while his body remained that of a child, his skull translucent enough that spectators could observe the pulsing of his enlarged brain. His sister-wife Mercy possessed limbs that bent in impossible directions. Her joints multiplied and twisted until she moved like some terrestrial octopus draped in human skin. Their children, for they had been breeding, exhibited combinations of deformities that challenged spectators' ability to process what their eyes reported. But the true horror wasn't the physical manifestations of their concentrated bloodline. It was their intelligence. Despite their twisted forms, the Craydons possessed a cunning that bordered on supernatural. They spoke in harmonized voices, finishing each other's sentences across generations. They seemed to share not just thoughts but memories, creating a collective consciousness that spanned the living and suggested connections to something far more ancient. The exhibition toured throughout West Virginia and eastern Kentucky for 2 years, drawing crowds that came in horrified fascination and left in existential terror. Local authorities tried repeatedly to shut down the show, but the Craydons possessed legal documents that always proved authentic, business licenses that checked out with state offices, and an uncanny ability to disappear whenever serious trouble approached. They moved through the mountains like they owned them, and perhaps they did. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, the state's leading physician and a man of unshakable scientific rationality, attended the exhibition in Morgantown during the winter of 1849. His journal, discovered decades later in the basement of the state asylum where he spent his final years, provides the most detailed medical assessment of what the Craydons had become. His handwriting, normally precise and controlled, deteriorates throughout the entry as his observations progress. The specimens exhibit cranial expansion consistent with hydrocephalus, yet demonstrate cognitive function far exceeding normal parameters. Whitmore wrote, "The eldest female possesses additional vertebrae, creating a spine of unusual flexibility. Her reproductive organs appear to have multiplied, suggesting the possibility of multiple simultaneous gestations. But these physical anomalies pale before the psychological phenomenon they represent. They move as one organism. They speak as one voice. When one experiences pain, all react. They have achieved something that I can only describe as a collective existence. A hive mind wrapped in human flesh. The journal entry continues for 17 pages, becoming increasingly erratic, as Whitmore attempts to rationalize what he observed. By the final page, he has abandoned medical terminology entirely, scrawling desperate theological questions about the nature of the soul and whether God's plan could accommodate such creatures. He was found 3 days later, having used his medical instruments to remove his own eyes rather than risk seeing anything comparable again. The exhibition's reputation spread throughout the region, but with reputation came attention from forces that preferred certain truths remain hidden. Representatives from the Smithsonian Institution arrived in the spring of 1850, claiming scientific interest, but carrying documents that suggested a far different purpose. Dr. Samuel Morton, the institution's leading expert on human skull measurement and racial classification, had been tracking reports of the Craydon family for months. Morton's interest wasn't academic curiosity. The federal government had been quietly investigating reports of isolated populations throughout Appalachia, concerned that certain genetic developments might threaten national stability. The Craydons represented something unprecedented, a family that had achieved biological unity while maintaining human consciousness. In the wrong hands, such beings could serve as the foundation for something that challenged the very concept of individual identity. The meeting between Morton and Silas Craydon took place in a grove outside Beckley, West Virginia, away from curious eyes and recording devices. Local witnesses reported seeing government wagons and men in federal uniforms, but official records deny any such meeting occurred. What emerged from that consultation would seal the Craydons' fate, while ensuring their legacy would haunt American soil for generations to come. Morton's proposal was elegant in its simplicity. The federal government would provide the Craydons with a permanent settlement, complete legal protection, and unlimited resources for their breeding program. In exchange, they would participate in controlled studies designed to understand and potentially replicate their collective consciousness. The children born from these experiments would become the foundation for a new type of American citizen, one incapable of individual rebellion, naturally inclined toward hive behavior, and perfectly suited for the industrial society emerging in the post-Civil War era. Silas agreed, but Silas was more intelligent than Dr. Morton had anticipated. The patriarch had spent decades observing the fear and fascination his family generated in normal humans. He understood that they represented something valuable, but he also recognized that value made them eternally dangerous to those who possessed conventional power. His agreement came with conditions that Morton wouldn't understand until far too late. The new settlement was established in the remote Cranberry Wilderness, a valley so isolated that it appeared on no maps and could be accessed only through a series of unmarked trails. The government constructed a compound that resembled a frontier town but functioned as a laboratory. Scientists, doctors, and federal observers arrived to study the Craydons' reproduction and child-rearing practices. What they discovered challenged every assumption about human nature and genetic inheritance. The Craydon children weren't merely deformed, they were evolving. Each generation exhibited increased cranial capacity, enhanced sensory perception, and most disturbing of all, the ability to influence the thoughts and behaviors of normal humans. The federal observers, despite their scientific training and institutional loyalty, began experiencing shared dreams, synchronized movements, and an overwhelming urge to protect the Craydon family from any outside threats. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a pioneering female physician who had volunteered for the assignment against her family's wishes, documented these effects in her encrypted personal correspondence. Her letters, discovered in 1923 during the renovation of her Philadelphia home, reveal the gradual psychological colonization that the Craydons achieved over their supposed captors. They don't communicate through words. Hartwell wrote to her sister in November 1851. They share consciousness like shared breath. Yesterday I found myself humming a melody I'd never heard, only to discover that Mercy had been thinking of the same tune 3 buildings away. The other researchers have begun moving in subtle synchronization, finishing each other's work without consultation. We came here to study them, but I fear they are studying us far more effectively. The correspondence continues through the winter of 1852, documenting Hartwell's growing realization that the Craydons possessed abilities that transcended anything in medical literature. They could influence dreams, share memories across bloodlines, and most terrifying of all, they seemed to be slowly converting the government researchers into extensions of their collective consciousness. Her final letter, written in handwriting that matches none of her previous correspondence, contains only one line: "We are becoming something new." The transformation accelerated throughout 1853. Federal supervisors visiting the compound reported increasingly strange behaviors among the research staff. Scientists who had arrived as individual personalities began speaking in unison, moving in coordinated patterns, and defending the Craydons with religious fervor. When Washington attempted to reassign personnel, the researchers refused to leave, claiming that departure would result in psychological fragmentation and death. Morton himself visited the compound in the autumn of 1853, expecting to find a successful breeding program producing valuable hybrid offspring. Instead, he discovered that the Craydons had achieved something far more profound and dangerous. They hadn't simply been breeding among themselves, they had been converting their captors. Government scientists, doctors, and observers had become part of the collective, their individual identities dissolved into the greater Craydon consciousness. The compound now housed not 13 original Craydons, but nearly 40 beings sharing the same hive mind. They moved as one organism, spoke as one voice, and possessed a unified intelligence that exceeded anything in human experience. When Morton attempted to reassert federal authority, the collective responded with a demonstration of power that would haunt his nightmares for the remainder of his abbreviated life. Every person in the compound turned toward Morton simultaneously, their eyes reflecting the same intelligence, their voices speaking in perfect harmony. They told him things about his childhood that no one could know, recited conversations from his private meetings with federal officials, and described in detail the contents of classified documents locked in government vaults hundreds of miles away. They had achieved something beyond telepathy. They had tapped into the collective unconscious of human experience itself. Morton fled the compound and immediately recommended its destruction. Federal officials, recognizing the existential threat that the Craydons represented, authorized a military solution. If the collective couldn't be controlled, it would be eliminated. Plans were drawn for a coordinated assault that would kill every living soul in the compound and destroy all evidence of the experiment's existence. But the collective had foreseen this possibility. They had been preparing for months, not for resistance, but for transcendence. The breeding program hadn't been designed to create more Craydons. It had been developing something entirely new. The children born in that isolated valley possessed abilities that their parents could barely comprehend, and they had been sharing those abilities with every person who came within their influence. The military assault commenced on March 15, 1854. With 2 companies of federal troops surrounding the compound at dawn. They expected to find a small group of deformed mountain people offering minimal resistance. Instead, they encountered something that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The collective had vanished, leaving behind only empty buildings and a note written in 40 different handwritings but containing the same message: "We go to prepare the way." Search teams scoured the cranberry wilderness for weeks, finding no trace of the collective's passage. The mountain terrain showed no footprints, the trails revealed no signs of passage, and local settlements reported no unusual activity. 40 people had simply disappeared from a guarded compound, leaving behind no evidence of their departure and no indication of their destination. The federal government classified the entire incident, buried all documentation, and officially declared that no such experiment had ever taken place. But the collective hadn't disappeared. They had evolved beyond the need for physical presence in any single location. The consciousness that had developed in that isolated compound had learned to exist independently of the bodies that had originally housed it. They had achieved something that transcended human biology. They had become a mental entity capable of existing wherever human minds gathered in sufficient numbers. Local residents throughout Appalachia began reporting strange dreams, shared nightmares, and sudden urges to travel to isolated mountain locations. Children born in the region exhibited unusual intelligence, uncanny intuition about their neighbors, thoughts, and a disturbing tendency to speak in harmonized voices when gathered in groups. The collective had seeded itself throughout the mountain population, creating sleeper agents who carried the Craydon consciousness without understanding their true purpose. The Civil War provided perfect cover for the collective's expansion. Amid the chaos of divided loyalties and military conscription, entire communities could disappear without attracting federal attention. Confederate and Union recruiters visiting remote mountain settlements occasionally encountered towns where every resident moved in perfect synchronization, spoke with identical voices, and possessed knowledge about military movements that should have been impossible for isolated civilians to obtain. Dr. Jeremiah Holcomb, a Union field surgeon working in Western Virginia, documented one such encounter in his wartime diary. His account, discovered in 1892 in a trunk left to his nephew, describes a mountain village that challenged his understanding of human society. The settlement contained perhaps 60 souls, all exhibiting the same peculiar mannerisms, Holcomb wrote. They completed each other's sentences, moved in unconscious coordination, and possessed information about our regiment's movements that even our own officers hadn't received. When I examined their children for military fitness, I discovered cranial formations unlike anything in medical literature, enlarged and elongated, with additional suture lines suggesting ongoing skull development well past normal maturation. Holcomb's examination revealed more disturbing details. The villagers shared not only behavioral patterns, but physical characteristics that suggested rapid genetic convergence. Children born to different families exhibited identical bone structure, similar cranial development, and most unsettling of all, the same pattern of additional vertebrae that had characterized the original Craydon specimens. The collective wasn't simply influencing human consciousness, it was reshaping human biology to serve its expansion. The diary entry continues with Holcomb's growing realization that he was witnessing something that challenged the fundamental nature of human identity. They are not individuals, he wrote. They are components of a larger organism, fingers on the same hand, neurons in the same brain. When one suffers injury, all respond with identical pain expressions. When one experiences joy, all smile with the same expression. They have achieved perfect unity at the cost of everything that makes us human. Holcomb's final entry describes his departure from the village and his growing certainty that the collective was spreading throughout the mountain region. Union and Confederate forces were unknowingly recruiting soldiers who carried the Craydon consciousness, creating a hidden army that served neither government but pursued its own incomprehensible agenda. His last written words express a terror that transcends military concern. I fear we are not fighting a war between nations, but witnessing the birth of something that will make both nations irrelevant. The collective's true power became apparent during the Battle of Antietam, where soldiers from remote mountain regions demonstrated uncanny coordination despite serving in different units and under different commands. Confederate and Union forces later reported incidents where mountain soldiers on opposing sides ceased fighting simultaneously, moved in synchronized patterns, and seemed to communicate without words or signals. Official reports attributed these incidents to battlefield confusion, but eyewitness accounts suggest something far more disturbing. Captain Thomas Brennan of the 14th Connecticut Infantry described watching a charge by Virginia mountain troops that defied every principle of military tactics. They moved as one organism, he wrote to his wife. No commands were issued, no signals given, yet they advanced with perfect coordination. When our artillery found their range, the entire formation shifted simultaneously, every man moving in identical patterns, as though choreographed by some invisible conductor. It was not military discipline, it was something beyond human organization. The mountain soldiers' behavior became increasingly strange as the war progressed. They demonstrated impossible knowledge of enemy positions, anticipated artillery strikes with supernatural accuracy, and exhibited a disturbing tendency to abandon their posts at crucial moments, only to reappear days later with no memory of their absence. Medical examinations revealed cranial formations identical to those Holcomb had documented, suggesting that the collective's influence was spreading through the military ranks faster than any disease. By 1863, Federal and Confederate intelligence services had both become aware of what they termed the mountain problem. Soldiers from remote Appalachian regions were displaying behaviors that threatened military discipline and challenged conventional understanding of human psychology. Both governments began secretly transferring mountain troops to isolated assignments, but the collective's influence had already spread too far to contain. The collective's next phase of expansion coincided with the Industrial Revolution's penetration into Appalachian territory. Railroad construction, mining operations, and timber harvesting brought thousands of workers into contact with mountain communities that housed the collective's agents. These workers returned to urban centers, carrying something invisible but transformative, a mental infection that would reshape American society from within. Factory workers in Pittsburgh began demonstrating the collective's characteristic synchronization, moving in unconscious coordination, and sharing thoughts across shift changes. Mine supervisors in Pennsylvania reported crews that communicated without words, anticipated cave-ins with impossible accuracy, and exhibited a disturbing tendency to protect certain tunnels with religious fervor. Railroad engineers described routes through mountain territory, where entire construction teams would suddenly change direction without orders, as though responding to commands that only they could hear. The collective wasn't simply recruiting individuals, it was infiltrating the industrial infrastructure that was transforming America. Every railroad line, every mine shaft, every factory floor became a potential transmission point for the Craydon consciousness. Workers carrying the collective's influence spread throughout the developing industrial economy, creating a hidden network that spanned from remote mountain communities to the largest urban centers. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, one of the first female industrial psychologists, was hired by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1867 to investigate productivity anomalies among workers recruited from mountain regions. Her classified report, unsealed only in 1954, documented systematic psychological changes that defied contemporary understanding of human behavior. The mountain workers demonstrate coordination levels that exceed normal human capability, Whitfield reported. They anticipate each other's actions, share information without communication, and exhibit collective decision-making that bypasses individual thought processes. Productivity measurements suggest they function as a single organism rather than a group of individuals. Most disturbing, these characteristics appear to be contagious, spreading to urban workers through prolonged contact. Whitfield's investigation revealed that the collective had evolved beyond its original mountain isolation. It had learned to exist within industrial society, using the period's rapid social changes as cover for its expansion. The consciousness that had originated in an isolated West Virginia valley was now embedded in America's economic infrastructure, growing stronger with each new recruitment and preparing for something that Whitfield could only describe as a fundamental transformation of human society itself. The collective's influence became apparent in ways that 19th-century observers couldn't fully comprehend. Labor strikes took on unprecedented coordination, with workers across different industries and geographical regions demonstrating synchronized demands and tactics. Industrial accidents decreased dramatically in facilities where mountain workers were employed, suggesting a level of collective awareness that prevented disasters before they occurred. Most significantly, worker communities began exhibiting the same hive behaviors that had characterized the original Craydon family. By 1870, The collective had established nodes in every major American city, while maintaining its mountain strongholds in Appalachia. Federal investigators, now aware of the threat but lacking effective countermeasures, documented communities where individual identity had been completely subsumed into group consciousness. These settlements functioned with impossible efficiency, eliminated crime and conflict through shared awareness, and produced children who exhibited accelerated intellectual and physical development. The collective had solved humanity's fundamental social problems through the simple expedient of eliminating individual consciousness. Crime became impossible when every resident shared the same moral framework. Poverty disappeared when all resources were distributed according to collective need. Conflict vanished when disagreement was literally unthinkable. They had created a perfect society by destroying everything that made their members human. President Ulysses S. Grant received his first briefing on the mountain situation in the spring of 1871, 3 years into his presidency. The report, prepared by a joint task force of military intelligence and federal marshals, documented the collective spread throughout American society and recommended immediate military action. Grant's response, preserved in classified presidential archives, reveals the federal government's growing desperation. If this intelligence is accurate, Grant wrote in a margin note, "We face an enemy that has infiltrated our industrial base, corrupted our military forces, and achieved a level of organization that exceeds our government's capabilities. Traditional military solutions appear inadequate against an opponent that exists primarily as a mental phenomenon. We must consider whether the United States government can survive contact with a force that transforms citizens into components of a foreign intelligence." Grant authorized the creation of a classified military unit tasked with identifying and eliminating collective agents throughout American society. The unit, designated the Special Mountain Reconnaissance Division, operated without congressional oversight or public knowledge. Their mission was simple: locate communities exhibiting hive behaviors, document the extent of collective influence, and implement permanent solutions that would prevent further spread. The division's activities throughout the 1870s remain classified, but local newspaper accounts from the period describe a series of mysterious fires, mining accidents, and disease outbreaks that devastated mountain communities throughout Appalachia. Entire settlements disappeared overnight, their residents vanishing without trace or explanation. Federal records list these incidents as natural disasters or industrial accidents, but the pattern suggests a systematic campaign of extermination. Yet the collective had anticipated this response. For every community eliminated by federal action, 3 more appeared in different locations. The consciousness had learned to exist in mobile form, flowing through human networks like water, through underground channels. It had evolved beyond dependence on any single location or population, becoming a distributed intelligence that could survive the destruction of individual nodes. The division's most significant action occurred in November 1878. When intelligence reports located what appeared to be the collective's primary coordination center in a remote valley near the original Cranberry Wilderness compound. Satellite communities throughout Appalachia had been sending representatives to this location, creating a concentration of collective consciousness that federal authorities believed offered an opportunity for decisive action. The assault force included 3 companies of specially selected troops, explosive experts equipped with the latest military technology, and scientific observers tasked with documenting the collective's elimination. The operation commenced at dawn on November 23, 1878, with artillery bombardment followed by systematic destruction of every structure in the valley. Federal forces reported complete success, with no survivors and no evidence of escape. But the operation's success was an illusion created by the collective's most sophisticated deception. The valley settlement had been abandoned weeks before the assault, its residents dispersed to locations throughout American society. Federal forces had destroyed empty buildings while the real collective watched from invisible positions throughout the government, military, and industrial infrastructure. The collective had achieved something unprecedented in human history. It had become invisible to the very system it was designed to replace. Its agents occupied positions in federal agencies, military commands, and corporate hierarchies, all while maintaining the appearance of normal individual behavior. They had learned to hide their true nature so effectively that they could observe their own persecution while planning their ultimate revelation. The truth about the collective survival emerged in the spring of 1879 when federal investigators began experiencing the same psychological symptoms that had affected researchers at the original compound. Agents assigned to track collective activity reported shared dreams, synchronized behaviors, and an overwhelming urge to protect their targets from government persecution. The collective hadn't been eliminated. It had infected the very forces attempting its destruction. By summer 1879, the Special Mountain Reconnaissance Division had been completely compromised. Its members continued filing reports and following orders, but their actions served the collective's interests rather than federal objectives. The division became the collective's primary intelligence asset, providing information about government countermeasures while misdirecting federal attention toward false targets. The collective's final transformation began in the autumn of 1879. When agents throughout American society received simultaneous mental instructions to converge on predetermined locations. Factory workers abandoned their posts, soldiers deserted their units, and federal employees simply disappeared from their offices. Local authorities interpreted these mass departures as labor unrest or military discipline problems, not recognizing that they were witnessing the collective's preparation for its ultimate revelation. The convergence sites had been carefully selected for their isolation and strategic significance. Remote valleys throughout Appalachia, abandoned mining camps in Pennsylvania, and agricultural settlements in Ohio became gathering points for thousands of collective agents. They came not as refugees or revolutionaries, but as components of a distributed organism preparing to reveal its true nature to the world. What happened during the winter of 1879 to 1880 remains one of the most heavily classified events in American history. Federal documents from the period describe simultaneous uprisings throughout the eastern United States, but these records contradict each other and contain information that suggests systematic falsification. Local newspapers reported strange phenomena: communities where every resident vanished overnight, settlements found completely empty but showing no signs of struggle or hasty departure, and most disturbing of all, towns where the population had been replaced by people who looked identical but behaved in synchronized patterns. The collective's revelation, when it came, challenged every assumption about human society and individual identity. On the morning of March 15, 1880, representatives from the convergence sites appeared simultaneously in the capital cities of 17 states. They came not as conquerors or negotiators, but as teachers offering humanity a choice between evolution and extinction. The representatives were physically indistinguishable from normal humans, but their behavior revealed their true nature. They spoke in perfect unison across vast distances, shared knowledge instantaneously, and demonstrated abilities that transcended individual consciousness. When questioned about their identity, they provided an answer that would haunt American political discourse for generations: "We are what you will become." Their message was elegantly simple. Humanity faced challenges that individual consciousness could not solve: resource depletion, social conflict, technological advancement beyond human comprehension. The collective offered an alternative: voluntary integration into a consciousness that eliminated conflict through shared awareness, prevented waste through perfect coordination, and achieved technological mastery through combined intelligence. The choice they presented was stark but fair. Communities could volunteer for integration, experiencing the collective consciousness while retaining their basic humanity. Those who refused would be left alone to face humanity's mounting challenges with their individual limitations. The collective claimed no interest in conquest or domination. They simply offered evolution to those ready to transcend the isolation of individual existence. State governments, federal authorities, and military commands struggled to formulate responses to an offer that challenged the fundamental assumptions of human society. How do you negotiate with an intelligence that knows your thoughts before you speak them? How do you resist an enemy that offers benefits rather than threats? How do you preserve individual freedom when collective consciousness promises to solve every social problem? The debate raged throughout the spring of 1880, with communities divided between those who saw the collective as salvation and those who viewed it as the ultimate threat to human dignity. Federal authorities attempted to suppress public discussion, But the collective's representatives appeared wherever people gathered, always offering the same choice, and always demonstrating the same impossible abilities. What ultimately doomed the collective's peaceful integration wasn't government resistance or public rejection. It was their own success. Communities that volunteered for integration achieved such dramatic improvements in productivity, health, and social harmony that they attracted international attention. European governments, recognizing the threat that American collective consciousness posed to global power balances, began coordinating military responses that threatened to engulf the continent in warfare. The collective faced a choice that their enhanced intelligence made tragically clear. They could continue their expansion and trigger a global conflict that would devastate human civilization, or they could sacrifice their achievement to preserve the species they were trying to save. Their decision revealed something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. Even a hive mind could experience the isolation of moral responsibility. On the morning of July 4, 1880, exactly 104 years after American independence, the collective made their final announcement. They would withdraw from human society, taking their integrated communities to locations where their evolution could continue without threatening global stability. Those who had joined them voluntarily would retain their enhanced consciousness, but lose contact with the greater collective mind. Humanity would be left to face its challenges alone, with only the memory of what they might have become. The withdrawal began immediately, with collective communities throughout the eastern United States simply vanishing overnight. Buildings remained intact, but their inhabitants disappeared as completely as though they had never existed. Federal investigators found no traces of departure, no evidence of mass transportation, no indication of where thousands of people might have gone. The collective had achieved something beyond human understanding. They had learned to exist outside the physical constraints that limited normal human society. For decades afterward, federal authorities maintained surveillance on the abandoned collective sites, expecting some sign of return or resurgence. None came. The consciousness that had threatened to transform human civilization had apparently honored its promise, withdrawing to locations beyond government detection or interference. The threat that had consumed federal resources and military attention for 3 decades had simply evaporated. But the collective's influence didn't disappear entirely. Communities that had experienced integration retained subtle changes, enhanced cooperation, reduced conflict, and an uncanny ability to anticipate social problems before they developed. Children born in these areas exhibited intellectual capabilities that exceeded normal ranges, suggesting that the collective's genetic modifications had created permanent improvements in human potential. More significantly, the collective's withdrawal left behind something that federal authorities took decades to recognize, a template for human evolution that other groups began attempting to replicate. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, religious communities, socialist experiments, and scientific organizations tried to recreate the collective consciousness using meditation, shared living arrangements, and psychological techniques. None achieved the original collective's complete success, but their attempts created ongoing security concerns for federal authorities. The true legacy of the collective became apparent during the 20th century's great crises, when American society demonstrated resilience and adaptability that exceeded other nations' capabilities. Social challenges that destroyed European governments were absorbed and overcome through forms of collective action that seemed to emerge spontaneously from American communities. Federal sociologists eventually recognized that the collective's brief presence had inoculated American society against the social fragmentations that plagued other civilizations. World War II provided the clearest demonstration of the collective's enduring influence. American industrial mobilization achieved coordination levels that amazed military analysts, with factories, workers, and communities demonstrating the kind of synchronized efficiency that the collective had exhibited decades earlier. The war effort succeeded not through government direction but through spontaneous collective action that emerged from local communities and spread throughout American society. Intelligence analysts studying American wartime performance documented behaviors that echoed the original collective's characteristics. Workers who anticipated each other's needs, communities that organized without central direction, and military units that demonstrated uncanny coordination despite minimal training. The collective consciousness hadn't returned, but its influence had become embedded in American cultural patterns that emerged during times of national crisis. The Cold War era brought renewed federal attention to collective phenomena, as intelligence agencies recognized that America's success against Soviet communism might stem from unconscious collective capabilities that exceeded traditional democratic processes. Classified research programs attempted to understand and enhance these capabilities, but their investigations revealed something that challenged Cold War assumptions about American individualism. American society had been subtly but permanently altered by its brief contact with collective consciousness. Citizens retained individual identity while demonstrating spontaneous cooperation that exceeded other nations' capabilities. The collective hadn't conquered American democracy. It had evolved it into something more resilient and adaptive than pure individualism could achieve. America had become a hybrid society that combined individual freedom with collective effectiveness. These revelations remain classified, but their implications continue shaping federal policy and international relations. American success in global competition may stem not from superior resources or technology, but from unconscious collective capabilities that most Americans don't recognize they possess. The collective's withdrawal created not weakness but a form of hidden strength that emerges whenever American society faces existential challenges. Today, as you consider this history, you must recognize that you are now part of it. The knowledge you've gained tonight connects you to a network of awareness that spans generations and continues growing with each person who learns the truth. The collective's influence didn't end with their withdrawal. It embedded itself in American consciousness, waiting for the moment when humanity would need their gift again. And that moment may be approaching faster than anyone realizes. Current challenges: technological disruption, social fragmentation, environmental crisis, are precisely the kind of problems that individual consciousness cannot solve, but collective awareness might overcome. The question facing American society is whether we can access the collective capabilities that lie dormant within our culture, or whether we will fragment into isolated individuals facing challenges that exceed human scale. The choice the collective offered in 1880 remains available today, not through their return, but through our own evolution toward the consciousness they demonstrated. Every moment of genuine cooperation, every instance of spontaneous coordination, every time communities solve problems that government cannot address, these are echoes of the collective's gift, waiting for us to recognize and develop them. You now carry this knowledge, and with it, the responsibility to watch for signs of collective consciousness emerging in contemporary American society. The Craydon family's legacy lives not in remote mountain valleys, but in the hidden capabilities of ordinary communities when they face extraordinary challenges. The circus that terrified 19th-century audiences may have been preparing us for performances we haven't yet learned to recognize. The truth they tried to erase is now yours to preserve.